I was going to say this meeting is going to be recorded, so Zoom very politely informed us. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor and privilege to welcome you to this webinar on the topic of violence against journalists organized by Hephaestus Wien, Österreichisch-Griechischer Integrationsverein in cooperation with the Association of European Journalists. When we agreed to schedule this webinar, we didn't know that the Nobel Peace Prize of 2021 would go essentially to journalists and journalism. Tonight's talk is dedicated to the memory of the noted investigative journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia. A speech by Mrs. Vella of the Daphne Caruana Galizia Foundation is scheduled to take place in a few minutes, but I am a staunch believer that there should be humanity in all things. So before we begin, I would like to extend my heartfelt condolences and sympathies to Ms. Vella, as the 17th of October marks 4 years and 1 day since her sister's assassination. We are so sorry for your loss. Before we begin, I would also like to note that questions are meant to come after the speeches, so please refrain from putting your hand up until we actually move to that at the end. And again, this webinar is being recorded. Without further ado, I would like to invite Mr. Perdikaris, Chairman of the Board and General Manager of the Athens-Macedonian News Agency. Mr. Perdikaris has a scheduling conflict, hence the reversal between him and Dr. Gstrein. Mr. Perdikaris.
Thank you, Eugenia. Thank you all dear friends. I'm glad to be with you today, even though the event we're discussing is about something that is unpleasant, but is a part of our real world. And dozens of our colleagues in many countries around the world have experienced incidents of threat or abuse, despite the fact that digital and social media give us free access to more and more information, at least under normal circumstances. But unfortunately, there are journalists who face fear, psychological terrorism, threats, verbal abuse, or even violent attacks against them. And some of them pay the price with their own lives, just as happened with Daphne. We all wish that she's the last victim of this situation, but we really know that looks like an unfulfilled wish, as this requires vigilance and hard work from all of us to prevent another bloody incident. We also know that the European Union is the world leader in freedom of press, but this does not mean that media professionals are really free in the European Union. The dramatic incident regarding that proves it, and the deep crisis in which the Slovenian news agency, SDA, finds itself and the confrontation with the Slovenian government is another example of serious interventions that are restricting the freedom of press, such as the suspension of the agency's funding and therefore the payment to its employees. And this was one of the main topics in last week's meeting of the European News Agencies Alliance, which took place in Vienna. Of course, a reason for this contradiction is the different treatment of threats or attacks against journalists in each EU member state. On the other hand, despite the fact that nowadays social media offer a lot of information to all of us, at the same time, they are a factor that intensifies these threats against journalists. And at the end of the day, many named, famous, or even anonymous users often point to their victims than just criticizing them, and they incite attacks against journalists. Even political leaders do not hesitate to act like that, and the way Donald Trump treated social media and journalists is still fresh in our minds. And unfortunately, Trump seems to have a lot of fans in Europe as well. In other words, while trust in the media industry and their people should be enhanced, given that in the EU we live in a democratic environment, in fact, the opposite is happening, and mistrust is growing and becoming an enemy that often takes the form of violent attacks. And these attacks are often not only related to the reports of the journalists, but also to diversity. For example, female journalists are definitely more vulnerable than their male colleagues. And the same applies to those who do have different political views or are of a different sexual orientation, religion, or ethnicity. Our answer at the end should be solid. We, journalists, together must safeguard our work. We must claim that there are conditions under which our work will be really free and safe. Free press means independence, and without independence, there's no free press. With these thoughts, I'd like to thank you again for the invitation, and I wish you good luck in tonight's event.
Thank you, Mr. Perdikaris, for your interesting contribution. I would like to pass the proverbial microphone to Dr. Gstrein and thank him as well for his kind acceptance that Mr. Perdikaris go first, even though they're listed on the other way around on the invitation. Dr. Gstrein.
Dear participants of this webinar, Violence Against Journalists, on the 4th anniversary of Daphne Caruana Galizia's assassination, I have the honor to welcome you as member of the Austrian-Greek Association, Hephaestus Wien. During my almost 60 years of being a journalist, I have suffered different forms of violence, but never in such a brutal and treacherous way. Already as a young writer, I was expelled from Germany in 1966 because I published the memories of a Greek bishop in the hands of his Nazi torturers. But one of the torturers became again a high police official after the war, and he kicked me and my family out of Germany. On the opposite, in 1969, I was expelled from Greece by the military junta, and in 1985 from Egypt because of supporting the persecuted Coptic Christians. Later on, as a war correspondent, I was confronted with death, of course, in Chad, Afghanistan, Lebanon, and Iraq, but never with attempts of murder. This infame way to silence journalists, in so-called civilized countries, is a stigma of our days. Just to mention 15 years ago, the assassination in Moscow of Anna Politkovskaya, the shooting of Jan Kuciak and his bride, 2018 in Slovakia, and the year before at Malta, Daphne Caruana Galizia was blown up with her car. Our Hephaestus Wien has no Nobel Prize to awards to her, like it was given just now to investigating journalists Maria Ressa and Dmitry Muratov. But this webinar intends to be a contribution to Daphne's eternal memory as a martyr for truth and the freedom of journalism.
Thank you, Dr. Gstrein, for this very eloquent introduction. I have to say, I have heard your summaries about being expelled from here and there and everywhere so many times, and they never, ever get old. Not least because you are a master of your craft. That said, I am going to pass the proverbial mic over to Sofia Kartali. You are known as a noted investigative journalist who focuses on human rights. I imagine you also have some really wonderful things to say. Please. Mic needs turning on. It's on silence.
You're right. Okay now?
Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon to everyone present. Yes, indeed, I am Sofia Kartali, an investigative journalist. But what you don't know is that for the period of 1 year, I was also actually a member of a non-terrorist organization. That was at least what the Turkish state accused me of. And if I have to explain how did this happen, well, it happened after I got arrested in March 2020. During this was the period when the Turkish government actually trying to manipulate Europe, sending thousands of refugees and immigrants through the Greek border. I was imprisoned, luckily for me for a short time, because the Turkish gendarmerie found out actually about my investigations concerning Turkish dissidents who fled to Europe and in Greece, actually. And as expected by almost every non-democratic regime and by tremendous leap of logic, I was accused of being a terrorist. This is the paranoia of the Turkish state, actually. And luckily, I had a very good lawyer, and I spent that year in Greece. Of course, nobody cared except for my family. And I had actually the back of the Association of the European Journalists. And although one would imagine that going to Turkey and having an experience such as mine is something that would be considered almost natural for unfortunately, for every non-democratic regime, it was never expected that assassinations of journalists would ever take place on democratic ground, let alone on EU ground, as the case is for Daphne Caruana Galizia. Yes, I could say that Daphne's assassination in October 2017 actually took us totally by surprise. But what doesn't seem to surprise us anymore is that more assassinations have followed. And it seems that European democratic states just watching this happen. Actually, this is the most uncomfortable and the most actually unacceptable thing for all the journalists. And what we expect, however, is the enforcement of the obligation of every democratic state to safeguard the freedom of press and, needless to say, the lives of journalists. But we are still in 2021, living in a world in which brutal attacks against journalists continue. And there is something we see more and more, pernicious laws introduced by governments that criminalize investigative journalism and digital speech. And I have to add that apart from the pure journalistic side, there is the human side that we don't have to forget. There are people who are left behind, whether family, friends, who have to deal with the loss. And it was this human loss that I tried to explore with Matthew Caruana Galizia, Daphne's son. And let me remind you that he was the witness of the assassination of his mother, something that touched me deeply. And as you will see in the interview, it has affected his life tremendously as well. And I think it's time for us to watch the interview with Matthew. To add just that I took this interview in 2019 in Milan, where Matthew was a guest speaker in the presentation of a book about his mother. Are we ready?
Yes.
How would I describe my mother? It's one of the most difficult questions to answer, but even though to me growing up, there were many times when my mother really seemed superhuman. For me, the past 2 years have been like one long day or like one long nightmare from which I never wake up. It was fundamentally a question of public accountability. I think across my mother's career, she was angered when people weren't held to account for wrongdoing, when they were allowed to get away with it, when people allowed themselves to forget what happened. And as a result of that, there was never much justice for any of the past crimes in Malta. And obviously, the people who perpetrated these crimes, or people who wanted to engage in criminality, became more and more brazen because they kept testing the limits of what they could get away with. And that's how they became brazen enough to assassinate my mother. When you see what they did on that day, when they turned my mother's car into a ball of fire, you realize how evil and how dangerous these people are. Anger at the Prime Minister and his Chief of Staff. I thought then, and I think to this day, that they are the people who are ultimately responsible. The Prime Minister's Chief of Staff has to go to prison and has to spend the rest of his life there. That's what I was thinking on that day, in that moment when I was standing in front of the car. But we also have to make a distinction between the masterminds and the people who influenced and protected the masterminds. By influenced, I mean people who expressed a wish for my mother to be dealt with, and then the masterminds went about executing that wish. This was what makes what we're doing so difficult, that for long periods of time, you feel like you're getting absolutely nowhere. I really feel strongly that we will get there if we're able to keep up what we're doing, and if people continue to help us, or if more people help us, then we will get there. The only way that that's going to happen is outside pressure on Malta to reform itself, to hold people to account, but also Maltese people have to find the courage to push for this internally. There have been some victories along the way, and I think that there have been instances of great harassment and abuse that we've had to endure, and I feel like we're never going to be able to rest until we get full justice for my mother.
We seem to have moved from Mrs. Kartali's speech to a further one, but are you still speaking, Ms. Kartali?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, so still holding the mic, or shall I pass it on?
You can pass it.
Okay.
I don't think that I have to say after this interview, I don't have to add something else.
I think the only thing to add after this interview is profound silence, because it speaks louder than words sometimes. If I may be allowed a comment, the way Matthew was speaking reminded me a lot about the things I heard when I was in England visiting the Cathedral of Canterbury, and I was hearing about the assassination of Thomas à Becket, who was Archbishop of Canterbury at the time and who is still remembered as a saint. Anyway, next up, Mrs. Vella, it is your turn. Thank you so much for being with us. And again, all our sympathies, all our condolences, and all our I don't really know what to say on that because I have never been in your position. I hope never to be. Please, safety of journalists is essential to democracy. I'm sure we all already agree, but we stand ready to hear your voice and the testimony it brings.
Thank you. When George first contacted me, this is the topic I suggested that I would talk about. But having heard from everybody so far, including Matthew, it's really hard to feel that I have anything that I can say, because all of your experiences, could not say it better than anything I have to say. If I can add to anything that Matthew said there, it's simply that the world didn't know, but over here, people could see it coming. Things were getting more and more dangerous for Daphne. The atmosphere was more and more hostile. And it's interesting that you brought, if you're here now, it's interesting that you brought up the idea of the Henrician experience in Canterbury, because it is really what has happened to Daphne, and this is documented. When, you have an atmosphere where someone is only seen to be a nuisance and someone is calling for that nuisance to be removed, and there are no obstacles to removing that problem, then it becomes possible for that person to be killed. And we know now, definitely, both from our experience and also from the public inquiry, which closed earlier this year, this is documented, that the state must bear responsibility for Daphne's murder because there was a culture of impunity and because there was a campaign against her orchestrated from within the Prime Minister's office, and this created the environment in which she was killed. It seems odd to actually even talk about safety of journalists being essential to democracy, but it's disturbing that it actually has to be said that unless journalists are safe, then you don't have a democracy, because journalists can't work without being safe. And it's not up to them as individuals, as people expected of Daphne, to do something for themselves. It is the state's responsibility. It's awful just to think that we actually have to say this, but it seems it has to be said. And when we think about the way Daphne's murder came about and the way it was dealt with by the state afterwards, and that even today you have to push against misinformation. It's very personally, it's terrible to think of, but it's also disturbing to me that in spite of the lessons that could be learned from Daphne's murder, other people remain at risk. That after she was killed, other journalists were killed. There was Jan Kuciak only a few months later. There was a journalist in Greece, Georgios. I'm afraid I don't pronounce his surname properly, but he was killed very recently. Peter de Vries in the Netherlands, which is one of the countries with the highest rankings for press freedom. Lyra McKee in Northern Ireland. We extend the idea of Europe beyond the European Union, then we're getting into a situation where there are more egregious situations for journalists. It is really awful to be seeing all of this and having to tell people that, yes, journalism is important. Journalists should be kept safe. It seems terrible that we have to say that even now. But one of the things we're working on as a foundation is precisely this problem, that we need to create an environment here in Malta which is enabling of investigative journalism. This is something that is also documented in the public inquiry. There are recommendations which we need to see implemented. And what we want to see there is the enabling environment being created here, and the mechanisms that are created to protect journalists are, should themselves be seen as protecting our own democracy. The message could not be stronger, the Nobel Peace Prize, that you cannot have lasting peace and democracy without the light that journalism shines. You see, I start out by saying I feel I don't have very much to add, given that I'm talking to journalists who have faced such traumas and such experiences. But perhaps out there are people listening to this webinar who take for granted their own safety, take for granted their own democratic rights, take for granted what they read in the news every day, and do not perhaps understand just what goes into keeping that news out there, keeping that democracy protected, keeping all of our rights protected. Perhaps somebody can put it better than I can, or more simply than I can. But, you know, on such an emotional occasion, it disturbs me that we still have to state the obvious, that we have to protect journalists because we have to protect journalism because it is essential to our democracy. And we also have to protect journalists because, you know, fundamental rights have to be protected as well. This is where it's at.
Thank you, Mrs. Vella, for your words. I think in addition to finding them very accurate, we all find them very touching. I'm going to add a couple of statistics to them. According to the International Press Institute Death Watch, there have been 30 journalists murdered so far in 2021, a COVID year, 55 in 2020, and 48 in 2019. And while some might argue that it is an improvement on the pre-existing data, because in 2018 we had 79 deaths, the fact of the matter is that just one is too much.
Absolutely. I mean, this is something that, as you said, one is too much. It's something we've said all along. Journalists should only have to raise the alarm once, and they should not have to do it by dying.
And not to mention, of course, the murder is pretty much the ultimate thing. I mean, all the things that Dr. Gstrein mentioned in his speech all the time, he was moved along politely. They also happen and we don't take note of them because they're not murder.
Because they're not murder, but there is a build-up to murder. Murder does not come first. There is a build-up. There is the isolation, discreditation, negation.
Right.
Yeah.
I believe I saw a poster once which said, stand up for what is right, even if you're standing alone. It's one of those things.
Yes.
But I think I'm hijacking Ms. Tausido's speech. So I am going to give Ms. Tausido the floor and the metaphorical microphone.
Thank you, Iphigenia. Thank you all for being here tonight. I think that after the video with Matthew interview, we are all very touched about, you know, the case of Daphne. We didn't have the chance to meet her, but we think that it's one of us. Daphne is one of us, and she was very brave. And I don't know. I only want to say that European Parliament have this year the first prize in her name. So it's very nice to hear that we never forget her. And a lot of journalists see her as a symbol, not only Daphne, but also Jean Cusack, George Carivas, and other journalists who killed during a reportage. However, today we are here to discuss about the freedom of the press after 4 years since the murder of Daphne.
Allow me to interrupt you. Could you please speak up? We're having a little, internet stuff.
Okay. The right of journalists to bring the truth to the world is to seek the citizens' right to information, although it used to be taken for granted and self-evident. Unfortunately, with the passage of time, it is becoming more and more difficult. The digital age has helped in the rapid dissemination of information and instant information, but not to correct and accurate information. With new technology, things have changed completely, as it is now much easier to do reporting, whereas before there was not even a telephone. But along with the positives of technological development, we also have the negatives, as the written press is declining and newspapers have lost their dominance in information, and sales have fallen dramatically in recent years. And this is a huge blow to quality journalism. Websites don't cross-check their information, not all, but a lot of them, and reproduce news without confirmation. Freedom of the press in Europe is a key component of democracy, as long as journalistic ethics are respected, of course. Press freedom is often violated, and many journalists have lost their lives because of investigative journalism and the revelation they made. Today, the circulation of news is now dominated by fear of the future and anger at the past in a widespread and crisis that is becoming the norm. He stressed that there is widespread misinformation and disinformation when a journalist deliberately channels a news story for other pursuits or personal gains. In the past, journalists used to be paid to write a news story. Now, today, they are also paid not to write something. I mean to hide. Regarding misinformation on the refugee issue, when journalists and media said that there were jihadists, if you remember, here in Greece, among the refugees in Diavata, when 95% of them were families. Threats on the life of a fellow Kurdish journalist by refugee traffickers forced him to leave Greece and take refuge in France. Intelligence services receive information from journalistic sources, and therefore journalists play an important role to this area. A good solution would be to establish journalism academies where experienced journalists would teach, because as abroad, they are useful and need to pass on their knowledge and experience to youngest people. Increasingly, the need for quality journalism is becoming clear, and this can be provided by another more interactive model of information where the interest of the public is ensured. It is the subscription websites where, with special questionnaires, people indicate what information they prefer and they adapt to it. In a rapidly changing digital age we live in today, one thing is certain: the rules of cross-checking and confirmation are not observed and in the reproduction of news and other information, and there is no signature on news and reports, nor what the sources are. In the digital age, subscriptions news is preferable so that we can have quality journalism while adhering to the ethical rules of journalism. The persecution of journalists in Turkey, their long-term detention in prison, and the constant persecution of journalists by the Erdogan government for criticizing him are worrying phenomena of lack of press freedom. An unacceptable situation of press freedom in Turkey that is far from European standards. The murders of Daphne Caruana Galizia, Jean Cusack, George Karayvaz, and so many others are an attempt to undermine our fundamental values and a blow to the rule of law in the European Union. We must work hard to strengthen the rights and duty of journalists to start by free and independent information. We owe this to all killed journalists and to all European journalists who fight on the front line every day in defense of our democracy. AJ International called all the national authorities to protect investigative journalists from any form of intimidation and defamation charges and from attacks aimed at silencing them. EU states must protect the personal safety and livelihood of investigative journalists and whistleblowers. What we want and ask from the national sections and European Union: better protection of journalists who are regularly subject to lawsuits intended to censor their work, a permanent EU theme to support independent investigative journalism, and draft EU directive to protect whistleblowers, the Commission to address challenges to media freedom and pluralism in the EU, and better monitoring of media ownership consideration. We know that MPs also discuss in European Parliament about the protection of journalists and about I have a paper here who said that MEPs ask member states to ensure adequate public funding to safeguard and promote pluralism, independent and free media. They also ask them to strengthen financial support to public service providers and investigative journalism while refraining from involvement in editorial decisions. To protect journalists from violence and threats, an independent and impartial regulatory body should be set up in cooperation with journalist organizations to monitor and report on violence. Journalists whose freedom to work has been threatened need effective legal procedures to be able to avoid self-censorship. I think that we have to work very hard. It is, how can I say, it is not very comfortable to discuss every year, believe me, from 2003 that I am member in this association. We also, in every Congress, we discuss about media freedom. I think that this must be a subject and we have to find solution immediately, because every day, even nowadays that digital is in our lives and we use internet to help our work, to find news or sources. We have to cross-check the information, not double, but 3 times, and never publish anything, even if we have it as a reportage, if we are not sure it is checked for every, you know, even if we have something first, it is better to check it before we publish it. So we have here today Otmar Lachodinsky, who was the international president before me, and he was a very successful president. Otmar also wrote about this media freedom in danger. So I want him to take the floor if he wants and say something about it. It is very important for us, the journalists, to be united and to find solution to protect our lives and our jobs. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Ms. Tausilo, for this wonderful contribution. I'd like to point out to everyone that Mr. Lachodinsky has also written something in the chat. And thank you, Mr. Lachodinsky, for your presence and your contribution. Do you want to, actually, we have just run through our speakers for the evening. So now is pretty much the time, I think, right? Now would be the time when we move to the audience and say, the floor is yours. The topic is a powerful one. There is a lot that could be said. So Mr. Lachodinsky, would you like to pick up the microphone or?
Okay, maybe just short. Yeah, by the way, there was a misunderstanding. It was written 6 o'clock you started at Central European time. I thought it is 6 o'clock Austrian time, but maybe, is it Greek time? 6 o'clock, maybe that was the mistake. Because now it's in Austria we have 6:40 and there was a notice at AEJ homepage that it starts at 6 o'clock. So I was, I think, an hour late. Sorry, I missed out some of the first part. But anyhow, I'll be brief. I mentioned already that AEJ and Saya said it as well. AEJ was quite active, our association, with protecting journalists, and we had also the one of the other son of Daphne Galizia that at our last physical conference in Paris, and he also was very. It was very moving to listen to him as our guest of honor. But I wanted to, because I think maybe it wasn't mentioned before, but you know, we have now the Slovenian presidency of the European Union, and the Slovenian Prime Minister is really all the time attacked journalists, not only Slovenian, but mostly Slovenian journalists. And he wanted to shut down the Slovenian press agency. I think he achieved it almost. They have no more state funds, and I think they were forced to close down. I just wanted to say that we have to be vigilant. And I was in contact, or I am still in contact with Mrs. Jourova, the Commissioner for transparency and basic values of the European Union. And I always keep reminding her that it's really necessary to step up the efforts, and also to step up the judicial inquiries in the murder of Daphne Caruana and all the other victims you mentioned this evening. So I will stop for now and greet everybody, especially Saya in Greece and all people who know me, and keep up the precious work. And yeah, we have to be really united, and yeah, solidarność, to use a Polish word, is very important. Also in Poland, because we have the same problems there with attacks on the media freedom. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Lachodinsky, for this contribution. Is there anyone else who would like to put their hand up for the next few words? Okay, Mrs. Kiropoulos, you're up.
Okay. Καλησπέρα everybody. Guten Abend. Buenos tardes. So I would like first to say that I have heard all of you, and I'm quite surprised. It was very emotional, especially when the son of Mrs. Daphne really spoke, and he spoke directly. He has spoken from his heart. And I just felt inside this injustice that he felt. And when we show the crushed car, the explosion of the car, etc., and during my investigation about her life and how many times she really got threats about her life in several ways, I just said, this woman, like our president said before, she's a symbol, and she's a role model, not only for us like journalists, but for us like human beings. And I'm very proud that I participate to this panel tonight, to this beautiful webinar. And the most important that I really heard and really motivate me is exactly this fact, that we have to know each other, to know better what is took place in Malta, okay? And maybe to know after that. So what about the organization there, how they have faced this reality, what about the audience or the people, and to exchange our knowledge. Like we have cultural heritage, we can have also this kind of space in this kind of level in our media. And we're not a small power, all of us. Let's say that we have a small light stone, but if we are going to concentrate all this light power inside us, the knowledge, the experience, emotions, the different perspectives, then we can make a beautiful sun. And this can be really, let's say, a big difference, because this sun, this human mosaic, will have its part of this experience also for the next generation and the next generation, and we're going to fight for something that is bigger than us. So Mrs. Daphne Caruana Galizia is a role model. It's not only simple, it's going to be a huge idea also for the next people. I just want to say that, and I would like also to say something in Greek, because we like also to honor the Greek language as well. Θα ήθελα να το μεταφράσετε, σας παρακαλώ, αγαπητή μου, Ιφηγένεια.
We will translate.
Νομίζω ότι η δικαιοσύνη είναι μία υπόθεση που αφορά τους πάντες, και όσο πιο δίκαια, με αρετή, αντικειμενικά την προσεγγίσουμε, τόσο πιο πολύ θα κερδίσουμε όλοι από τη γνώση, τις εμπειρίες, αλλά και την αντίληψη, γιατί δεν αλλάζουμε μόνο πώς...
Μισό λεπτάκι, θα πω την πρώτη φράση.
Okay.
So the first sentence was pretty much that justice is an affair of, is everyone's business, correct?
Correct, exactly.
And that it is a matter of virtue and of perception.
Και ακριβώς από την ατομική συνειδητότητα πηγαίνει στη συλλογική συνειδητότητα, η οποία αλλάζει την κοινωνική αντίληψη. Αυτό ήθελα να πω. Σας ευχαριστούμε.
Individual consciousness combines into collective consciousness and changes the world. Thank you. I have to say, dear Lena Kiropoulos, that this combines with a thought that I was having myself, which is that when I look at the recent developments in IT, when I look at the last decade of proliferation of blogs and of what people euphemistically like to call citizen journalism, what I see is that for all the inaccuracies and for all the inexactitudes that we see in the ways people are trying to be journalists with their blogs, we also see a tremendous load of sympathy for the work and the effort and the ethic of a professional journalist. And for all that we don't see expertise, not everyone is an expert at everything. We do see that the average common person of good faith has respect for the efforts, the work, the function. And that's already quite a big thing, I think, which also gives us reasons to be optimistic. And I'd like to augment your quote about coming together into a collective consciousness with a quote, which says, "It is not our part to master all the tides of the world, but to make every effort that we can for the succor of the years in which we are set, so that those who come after will have clean earth to till. What weather they shall have is not of our choosing." It's not entirely journalism devoted, but it is future oriented, and it is about the models of today coming together to construct a more beautiful tomorrow. So I think it pretty much combines well with what you just said. Thank you. I think that your comment about what happened there was addressed to Mrs. Vella. So shall I give her the microphone to answer, or was it someone else? Mrs. Vella?
Sorry, could you refrain that, because I'm not sure I could follow very well.
Mrs. Kiropoulos said we have to know each other and what took place, what happened, how they faced this reality, exchange knowledge. And I believe the word cultural heritage also came in. So I think in a sense what Mrs. Kiropoulos said is that your sister's murder in a sense becomes a part of the Maltese cultural landscape. And we would all like to know how.
It's interesting that you see it automatically as part of the cultural landscape. Unfortunately, even today, we fight against untruth, we fight against discreditation, we fight against misinformation and disinformation and attempts to derail the process of justice. So if Daphne's murder has become part of the cultural landscape, it's not a very pretty one. The ugly thing about the landscape here, as you describe it, is that the enormity of Daphne's murder has not been sunken into the national consciousness for what it is. That could be explained by lots of reasons. Fundamentally, it can be explained by the reasons that led to her murder. That the space for independent journalism is very restricted. That people prefer to believe opinions rather than facts. And that a strong propaganda campaign that was built up over years will take as many years and as many resources to come undone. And that's perhaps when Daphne's murder can be seen for what it is, understood by everybody for what it was. And that it's not simply a matter of something that can be swept aside or explained away simply. We've got quite a lot of deep reckoning to do as a state. I mentioned earlier that there was a public inquiry. This is documented. We still have to have a good public discussion about what that inquiry has found. And that's 10 weeks after the report was published. We've got an uphill struggle. We've been pushing for 4 years to find the truth about Daphne's murder, to bring people to justice and so on. And we are still fighting that battle today. Every day brings a fresh set of challenges.
I'm sorry to hear that, but all I can say is that at the very least, we are hearing your voice. And I know that it probably sounds like the cheapest thing anyone could possibly say, but we see you as you are, and we accept you as such among us here in a safe space.
It's not cheap at all. It's the sort of thing that people here have to see for themselves. It's good to know that people can see things as they are, but we were working towards people here seeing things as they are.
I think it is also the mission of every journalist in a way.
Yes.
To see and to show. We have a raised hand from a person called iPhone, who I very much suspect wasn't actually christened that. Who might this be? And also your microphone is off. Okay, please figure out what's keeping us from hearing you and or seeing you. Would anybody else like to contribute something? Ah, wait. Oh, we almost saw you for a moment.
Wait a minute. Sorry, I'm very bad at technology. I'm so impressed by this discussion, which I, like Ottmar, I got the wrong time zone. I'm so impressed by how articulate everybody is and how so clear-headed. I wanted to compliment Ottmar in what he's been writing recently about the Kurt scandal, because what that unearths is something that's actually been accepted for a very long time in Austria, which is simply the manipulation of journalists and bribery and journalists accepting. And I think we've come to accept an awful lot of things we should never accept. We should understand what a saint really Daphne was and remains, because she had so much courage, physical and moral courage, and which we don't always have. And I think it's a question of empowering and encouraging people who have that kind of courage. That's what saints are for. And I think also we need to understand that the right politicians, the politicians who are halfway honest and understand what we're talking about, are encouraged. I mean, people like Mrs. Jourova, who has been great. She's understood things very well. She's not especially powerful as a politician, but we can make her more powerful. That's one of our tasks, I feel. Beyond that, I can't tell you how moved I am by the courage and determination of Daphne's family, which is inspired, I'm sure, not just me. And I am lost in admiration for them. Thank you very much.
And Steen is the General Secretary of the National Association of European Journalists, and it's not your name in the I4. So
I was just going to say, we have whistleblowers here who have identified you.
yes.
Oh, good. Oh, good. Well, as long as that.
And I want to say that Otmar and Tent live in Austria, and they are in the Austrian Association of Journalists. Panagiotis, do you want to take the floor and say something? Panagiotis
Yes, hello. Good evening. First of all, I'd like to say that it was a very interesting topic and something that is around in the news everywhere, how the media and the work of journalists, how it is, how difficult it is to be done properly, as there is no, there is a lot of interference with the work of journalists, especially in the investigative journalism, because we have seen many cases where the journalists are trying to reveal the truth and explain things that the people are not able to find the truth. Especially, for example, we saw how difficult it is during the pandemic, for example, how difficult and how important it is for the people to find out the truth, and how much interest there is on the media to find out what's happening. And so the issue here is that the states should allow properly and protect the journalists in their work in order to be able to reveal the truth and not having any kind of interference, either being economic, like economic force or other force that should be not economic interference or other political interference, like to be threatened with that they will lose their job if they don't say what they have to say. And so the thing is that they have to be free from this. But what I believe is that the framework should be, the legal framework should be also enhanced. And I think we should, the association should press for a different legal framework in order to have a clear idea what should be allowed to, how the journalists should work and how the employers should not interfere with their operation, their work. That's what I think, is that we have to press for a different legal framework, more concrete and more clear on the rights, and that's my opinion, my view.
Thank you for this contribution. Actually, it's a really interesting question. The idea of the question of the how. What is it? I guess as you were speaking, I wondered to myself, is there anything that we as participants of a webinar, as journalists, as people contributing could do to signal that this is what we want? Because I mean, I know that they should offer these protections automatically, but perhaps we can also ask louder. So my question is, how would we signal something like this? Is anyone willing to take it on with ideas or suggestions? Okay.
As I told you, Iphigenia, before, we as association, we have made a lot of contacts with the institutions. And as Mark said, we have this special meeting with the Commission Eurova, and we discuss about this issue. And the Commission said, and seized right now to take some measures about this specific issue, about media freedom, about the protection of journalists. And we also try to push our national governments to take the same position. if we don't have independent media, we don't have free press freedom. And if the owners of the media are businessmen, you know what I mean, connected with the government, with the big constructions, if the journalists don't feel free to write what they have to do, I mean, to tell the truth to the people, not what the owner push him to say or to write for his interest, then we don't have free speech.
Which means that one of the moves that we could potentially view as the outcome would be to move against the conglomeratization of media. Just
exactly. I have to say that in a lot of European countries, there are media owners who are also businessmen. That means something about how independent can be a media and how independent can be a journalist to do the right job. So the investigative journalism is more dangerous than ever because the money is how can I say, the money is the power for the people who don't want investigative journalism. Because investigative journalism is about corruption, about the power of the people who try to rule the world. So we have to teach the young people, the young journalists, that they must fight for a journalist, because I used to teach in a journalistic school, and the students asked me if they have a future in this profession. And I said, yes, if you fight every day, because it's not easy. It's very hard path. This round is very hard.
I think in a seminar about the murder of a journalist, that much is very much a given, that this is a hard path. And yet I'd still rather be a journalist than be a miner, because I think that liberating spirits is a worthwhile pursuit. I think we all agree on this. But so this is a question from me, because I have those two, especially to you, Saya, to you, Otmar, to you, Edward. Have you seen any investigative journalists try to fund themselves via the use of websites such as Patreon? Or not really? Because it seems like, for those who don't know, Patreon is a website which encourages people to fund individuals as if they were essentially patrons. The old patronages, but not by rich people, by single individual people who will pay €1 or €2 per article. And, you know, when you are trying to fund the work of a work that is meaningful, that means something to you, that can amount to a decent living. And it might be a way to stand up to the corruption of the people in power, because they have nothing to do with funding this work. So is this something that journalists have considered? And is this something that you, as the Association of European Journalists, have recommended to members? Yes, like crowdfunding for the media, or like crowdfunding for meaningful causes that won't find business funding.
Hello? I'm specifically interested in this and have encouraged, for example, a newish publication called Byline Times in the UK. And Byline Times, for example, if we're speaking about media freedom, has become the home for certain journalists who've simply been excluded. I think of a particular individual who changed his mind about Brexit, very conservative, but very, very serious and principled man, who now writes for Byline Times, which is going okay, and it's funded in exactly the same way as you suggested. This man has been kicked out, having written about politics for the BBC, commented on for the BBC on the press, which he did for 20 years. And suddenly, he's too old, or we're looking for somebody new. They're simply scared at the BBC of the government and of independent voices. The same is true, not about funding, but about being scared by the government. And they need to have some kind of forum where they can speak and not starve. And that is actually possible. And we reported on the website the other day about the websites which are really doing very good work in Ukraine. I think that the younger people are much more knowledgeable and proficient at using the websites in that way. And I also think that we've become too used, especially this older generation, to being paid a nice salary to work for an established business. The whole business of journalism seems to have changed. I believe, and we're going to produce more and more evidence of it and see it, that it is possible actually to make a living as a journalist and to work reasonably independently of the owners. So if you take, for example, the man I'm speaking about, he worked at the Daily Telegraph for some phenomenal salary, really marvelous salary, because he was very articulate and serious. And then he discovered that the whole coverage of China was influenced by the advertising from HSBC. And he exposed them and resigned. He personally resigned. And I found that so admirable, as I found, luckily he hasn't been killed, or not yet. But Daphne, we all admire so much, because it's a question of moral courage, physical courage, financial courage, every kind of courage. That's what we need to encourage. And the rottenness of certain businesses, for example, in Austria, the Fellner brothers and their free newspapers, and the readiness that they show for accepting straightforward bribery with taxpayers' money is an outrage. And not all of us are so lacking in venality or so brave, but those are the people we need to support. And I wanted to mention too, I mean, journalism has changed in a number of different ways. The relationship with politicians, it's become more and more evident to the politicians that they can use us and exploit us or close us down, as they've done in Hungary, for example, or Slovenia was mentioned, just shut down or try to shut down, starve out the national news agency. These are things people have to understand, that this is an outrage, this is an assault on our basic freedoms and the pleasure of living in a proper democracy. So we do have a political role. The whole line between journalism and the power, the journalism and the political arrangements, the lines have become very blurred, and our task is really fundamentally important. On the topic of survival, I mean, there are ways to survive, but it's a question of adapting to arrangements that we can't change, that the newspapers do not have the same prosperity or solidity. But there are other ways of getting through. And I recommend what has happened in Ukraine. It's elegant and it's possible. And to encourage people that, yes, you can make a living in this work. And yes, it's sometimes dangerous and complicated, but it's possible. There's no need to despair, is my message.
I actually really like that message, because I'm one of those people who believe that that there's a saying which is that the greater the challenge, the greater the greater the challenge, the greater the opportunity. And while it is true, well, I see that it is true that there are many grave challenges in our times. I also see that there is one big thing, which is that we have to find a way around them. And we haven't gotten there yet, of course, but we will. Technical changes, the propagation of the internet, crowdfunding, such as you mentioned. And by the way, could you please write us the names that you mentioned in the chat so that we can, go and do our own investigations. All those things are things that are currently not working very well for journalists because they cause a drop in basically pay. They make it harder for journalists to keep going. But at the same time, if we find a way to make them work in our favor, they could reverse the situation quite drastically and quite fast. I think it's very much about finding the winning formula, but please don't ask me what that formula is. It's for smarter people than me. That said, I also have to say that I don't share the pessimism about the younger generation. I think if you have found a brave rebel anywhere, they're probably a teenager. So I think they'll figure it out if we don't. Knock on wood. I was wondering if anybody else had any other questions. Okay, not. Observations? Not either. So I think we have then pretty much not exceeded our time, which has got to count as a miracle. It's been a huge pleasure meeting you tonight and listening to everything that you had to say. I felt very honored by the depth of expertise that was shared. And also, as so many have noted, I was incredibly moved by Mrs. Vella's contributions and your nephew Matthew's contributions. And again, I think we are all so sorry for your loss. And one thing that deserves to be mentioned is that no matter how brave or how strong or how powerful the message of your sister's work may have been, we all recognize the fact that to you it is a much deeper and personal and much more human wound, and that no amount of awards will bring her back and fix this. And so all I can say is that I'm so sorry for your suffering.
Iphigenia, sorry, we have a raised hand.
We have a raised hand. Edward, sorry, I didn't notice. Yes. Okay, now the camera's off again. So yes, I guess I'm going to stop saying, anyway, with no further ado, thank you so much for being here tonight. Oh, yes.
I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for everybody for being here. Thank you for George for organizing this, and thank you to you, Iphigenia, for keeping us on track, and for your wonderful words. Thank you so much.
We will never forget Daphne's work, believe me, never.
Thank you. Really, thank you, everyone.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.